on bringing beneficial insects into the vegetable garden with native wildflowers. So gardening is an excellent activity for both our physical as well as mental well-being. A lot of people discovered this during the pandemic. It was a time when, a lot of people were lonely and feeling isolated during lockdown. They were concerned about their physical health, and a lot of people turned to gardening. There was a big uptick in gardening during the pandemic, and it helped a lot of people out during a tough time. It's really no wonder, because gardening is associated with psychological effects such as lower depression and anxiety, higher self-esteem, and the list goes on. Vegetable gardening in particular has clear nutritional benefits. So up here in the top right part of your screen, this is called USDA MyPlate. It is the current version of the old food pyramid, if you can remember that. And it's been really kind of like reconfigured in terms of emphasizing the different food groups. And you can see from looking at MyPlate that half of your overall food servings are supposed to be comprised of fruits and vegetables. According to the American Heart Association, we should have 4 to 5 servings each of fruits and vegetables per day. And it turns out that fruits and vegetables straight from the garden are really the best. I was kind of shocked to discover this, but if you look at this table on the right side of the screen in the middle, this is just kind of indicative of how the nutritional quality of fruits and vegetables rapidly decreases after harvest. So these are some commonly grown vegetables, and they were harvested and immediately refrigerated at 4 degrees Celsius, which is a standard temperature. And after just 7 days in the refrigerator, the spinach had lost 75% of its vitamin C. The green beans had lost 77% of their vitamin C. And this is true for other vitamins and minerals in these fruits and vegetables. Of course, I think vitamin C is one of the most sensitive, but there are lots of other nutritional compounds that are in fruits and vegetables that are really responsible for how healthy they are, and they decline rapidly after harvest. Broccoli, so one group of these compounds are called the glucosinolates, and glucosinolates have anti-cancer properties. And this is one reason why people who eat a lot of broccoli and other similar vegetables have a lower incidence of cancer. But it turns out that within just 1 week of harvest and refrigeration at normal temperatures, the glucosinolate contents of broccoli decreases by at least 70%. So the nutritional components are decreasing rapidly. Eating these fruits and vegetables right after harvest is really the best way to, get what they have to offer. And the only way you can do that is if you have a garden, a vegetable garden in your backyard. So it's really clear that gardens have a lot to offer in terms of their nutritional and psychological benefits. But that all goes down the drain if certain uninvited visitors show up. And these can affect both the nutritional quality of your food as well as affecting the psychological quality of your gardening experience. And these are what are called garden pests. And the pests are really any insect that is having a negative impact on your garden yield. And these are some of the common offenders here. In the lower left part of the screen, you have the tobacco hornworm. Now, a large tobacco hornworm can defoliate an entire tomato plant overnight. Moving up, you have the corn earworm. The corn earworm is a common pest of sweet corn. It can affect 90% of the ears in a given crop, and it focuses its consumption on the top part of the corn ear. The brown marmorated stink bug in the middle has a huge range of fruits and vegetables that it will damage, and it can lower the yield of many garden plants like peppers, sweet corn, and tomatoes by 50%. Its signature mark are these cloudy spots that are left in the fruit by its piercing and sucking mouth parts. And finally, in the top right corner, you have the ubiquitous aphid, which is literally sucking the life out of our garden vegetables and causing the yield to be lower. So traditionally, garden pests would be dealt with insecticides, but we're learning that it's just not an acceptable route. There's too much collateral damage, and it's harming non-target insects. And those non-target insects are really crucial for overall biodiversity and supporting the food chain. So what is a gardener to do when confronted with these garden pests? Whoops. The good news is that the gardener is not alone. You have insect allies that'll help you wage battle against these garden pests, and these are called beneficial insects. Now, the beneficial insects fall into three broad categories, and I'll just go through them one by one. First of all, on the left part of your screen are the predators. Now, the predators are the beneficial insects that are directly hunting and consuming the pests. These predators usually are not picky about what they're eating. They are generalists in terms of the pests that they will consume. They also have voracious appetites. And one great example of a predator is the convergent lady beetle, which, by the way, is Ohio's state insect. So the convergent lady beetle has a favorite prey, and that's aphids, but not too picky. If aphids aren't around, then she will go after other small soft-bodied insects that are sucking the sap of your plants, such as thrips and scales. The convergent lady beetle is typical of predators in her voracious appetite. She can eat more than 50 aphids per day and up to 5,000 aphids in her lifetime. There is another major group of beneficial insects here in the middle of the screen, and those are called parasitoids. Unlike the predators, the parasitoids don't hunt the pests. Rather, it is the parasitoid larva that consumes the pest while the larva is developing. So a perfect example of this are the tachinid flies. The tachinid flies look like house flies. You've probably seen them on your garden plants and you didn't even know that's what they were. They look like house flies, but they're extra bristly. Here we have the red-tailed tachinid fly. Now, the parasitoids are a little bit more specific than the predators in targeting the pest insects. For instance, the red-tailed tachinid fly targets the true armyworm. True armyworms are pests of corn, oats, wheat, and other grasses, and they do have a major effect on crops throughout Ohio. Now, the red-tailed tachinid fly deposits its egg near the head of the true armyworm. You can see it there. It's that little white spot by the head, and the placement is very deliberate. This is so the armyworm can't brush the egg off. Now, when that egg hatches, the red-tailed tachinid fly larva will consume the armyworm while the larva is developing. And finally, the true armyworm will die and the larva will pupate and become an adult red-tailed tachinid fly. Red-tailed tachinid flies can reduce true armyworm outbreaks by 50 to 100%. And this is true of other parasitoids. The wasps are a major group of parasitoids. There are predatory wasps, but there are also parasitoid wasps, and they target and limit lots of pest insects. They can lay hundreds of eggs per day, parasitizing those pest species. Finally, the last group of beneficial insects that is quite important on the right side of your screen are the pollinators. And the pollinators, of course, are the ones that are enabling the development of the fruits and the vegetables in your garden. Insect pollination is necessary for 35% of our food production, our crops worldwide. However, it greatly benefits 75% of our crops. So what do I mean by that? Well, a good example is the tomato. The tomato is, in fact, a wind-pollinated plant. The tomato doesn't really need insect pollination in order for tomatoes to form. However, when bees, which are the primary insects doing the pollination, when bees do pollinate tomato plants, it causes an increase in yield and size by 45% and 100% respectively. And that's for cherry tomatoes, was that particular study. So these aren't trifling impacts that the pollinators will have on these crops that don't necessarily require them. Another really important feature that some of our pollinators offer is something called buzz pollination. So there are a number of important crop plants that hold their pollen inside the stamen. And in order for the pollen to be released, the bee actually has to latch onto the stamen and shake it. And that's what's happening in this photo right here with this bumblebee at the tomato flower. It's shaking the pollen out, and that in that manner, it's able to pollinate the plant. Only certain bees are capable of buzz pollination, and I have 3 of them here. They are the bumblebees, up top, the green metallic sweat bees, and next to the bumblebee is the large carpenter bee. So that's an extra benefit that you get from some of our pollinators. And by the way, the European honeybee is not capable of buzz pollination. So that's just another reason to help conserve our native bees. So certain crops indeed require buzz pollination even to form a fruit, and those would be crops like blueberries, and then others like tomatoes and eggplants and others just greatly benefit from the buzz pollination. All right, now one thing that you'll notice about all of these beneficial insects that they have in common is that they all seem to be around flowers. For instance, the convergent lady beetle here, she's sitting on a milkweed flower. So what's going on there? Well, to answer this question, let's look at the habitat requirements of our beneficial insects. It turns out that the #1 habitat requirement of the beneficial insects are wildflowers to supply nectar and pollen to them. This is a major component of the diet of these organisms, even the predators. So the predators are out there hunting and consuming the pest species, but when those pest species populations are low, they're going to be supplementing their diet in a big way with pollen and nectar. So wildflowers are essential for creating habitat for beneficial insects. What else is essential? They need areas to nest. So for 70% of our bees and a large number of our wasps, that means some bare soil. They like to tunnel into the soil and build their nest there. And here in the middle left part of your screen, you can see a green metallic sweat bee staring out from its nest in bare soil. Another large fraction of our bees and wasps nest above ground in the hollow and pithy stems of plants. So in the top middle part of your screen, you can see what is really the best way to create this kind of nesting site for these bees and wasps. If you cut your flower stems to approximately 1.5 feet the year after the plant was growing, you will be creating the perfect nesting sites for these stem nesting bees and wasps. It's recommended that you allow the plant stems to stand during the winter time because that can be shelter and food for birds during the winter. But the following year, if you cut those old stems to 1.5 feet tall approximately, that'll be the perfect environment for those stem nesting bees and wasps. In the lower right part of the screen, you can see some decaying wood. This is another important nesting substrate for bees and wasps. Bees like large carpenter bees will burrow directly into the wood, and then there are other bees and wasps that will occupy old beetle burrows, and they'll use that as their nesting substrate. Another important benefit that the decaying wood offers is that it is a cool, moist environment under that decaying wood. That is also true of these large rocks in the center of the slide. Lots of beneficial insects, particularly predatory ground beetles, are going to really take advantage of that cool, moist environment during hot, sunny days. And then at night, they will emerge from that refuge and scour the ground surface for slugs and the larvae of lots of pest insects. So it's good to incorporate those components into the habitat as well. Finally, well, not finally, but moving on, we have bunch grasses. So in terms of overwintering habitat, the base of bunch grasses is one of the best places for ground beetles and other beetles like the ladybird beetle to spend their winters. You could have huge aggregations of lady beetles nesting at the base of bunch grasses, and the same is true for the ground nesting beetles, and that's where they're going to overwinter. Also, leaf litter. Leaf litter is kind of like the home court for so many of our beneficial insects. This is where they find shelter, and it's also where they will overwinter in various life stages. Lots of our beneficial insects, like the hoverflies, for instance, they will overwinter in the leaf litter either as an egg, a larva, a pupa, or as an adult. But all of those life stages are comfortable at home in this leaf litter. So it's important that you have some of that in your beneficial insect habitat as well. Finally, a brush pile is one of the best sources of shelter that you can incorporate into your beneficial insect habitat. And it turns out it's better to have 2 small brush piles rather than 1 big one. Okay, so these are the components of your beneficial insect habitat. But what does the beneficial insect habitat actually look like when you put it next to your vegetable garden? Okay, now here's an example of how you would go about designing it. First of all, when you're selecting those flowers, which are really the keystone to your habitat, you're going to want to focus on native wildflowers. And your habitat is really going to end up looking like what we could call a flower strip. And that's what you can refer to your habitat as, a flower strip. So when you're selecting your native wildflowers, like I was saying, the native species are the most important because they oftentimes will attract the most beneficial insects. And furthermore, those native species are critical to lots of our specialist bees. Specialist bees account for up to 45% of all of our bees. And these bees require the pollen from specific species or genuses of flowers in order for their larvae to mature. Many of our specialist bees require the pollen of native plants. So you're really going to focus on selecting native plants for your flower strip. You're going to want to have at least 8 species of flowers in your flower strip. Research has shown that you get a major increase in abundance and diversity of pollinators when you have at least 8 species in the garden. You're also going to want to select plants, if possible, that have continuous blooms throughout the growing season. And this is so all of those beneficial insects can have access to pollen and nectar to supplement their diets throughout the whole growing season. The size of the flower clusters has been shown to be one of the most important factors in attracting pollinators. And it looks like a 3-foot diameter flower cluster is kind of like what you want to shoot for in terms of getting the bees' attention. So flower clusters of at least 3 feet in diameter are ideal. Now, most of our native plants, they send up additional stems every year. So you're eventually going to get to that 3-foot size. However, if you want to fast track that, what you could do is plant in this suggested arrangement here, plant 3 seedlings in a triangle arrangement and have them spread out by approximately 1 foot on a side. And as they mature, you'll more rapidly get to that 3-foot size flower cluster. Lastly, you're going to want to put your flower strip as close as possible to your vegetable garden. So it's best if it's really right alongside the vegetable garden. Okay, so that's how you would go about designing and creating your flower strip. But just how effective are these flower strips? Well, there's been there's been some research done on this. It's definitely still in the early days in terms of kind of perfecting this. But if you look in the top right, the top center part of the screen, it's been found that overall pest abundance is reduced in cropland when there are flower strips by about 16% on average. Now, that's not a big reduction. However, I should mention to you that there are lots of exceptions to this where they have much greater pest reduction. For instance, in the top right here, this study was looking at the presence of aphids in potato fields that were bordered by flower strips and that weren't bordered by flower strips. And they found a 75% reduction in aphids in the potato fields bordered by flower strips. So it's definitely possible to get big reductions in your pest abundance by using the flower strips. Okay, now what about pollination services? Well, the results for pollination services have been really variable. However, it does appear that you can get a substantial benefit to your pollination services in your vegetable garden if your flower strip conforms to a few design factors. And those are, you want to have a high diversity planting for your flower strip. So that's what we were saying, like more than 8 species. Furthermore, the benefits to the flower strip often don't really become evident until the 3rd year. So the first couple years, probably your flower clusters are getting bigger. And finally, year 3, you're really starting to see the pollination benefits. This is also, I think, a reflection of the fact that you are drawing in pollinators that are making their homes in the flower strip, and that doesn't happen right away. So the more pollinators that you can actually get nesting in your flower strip, that means that you're going to have that population there that's going to only increase the pollinator benefits as the years go by. Finally, there is a clear association between how close the flower strip is to the crop and how many and what the pollination benefits are. You definitely want to have your flower strip less than 20 meters from all of the plants that are in your garden. And then you should see some benefits. There's a really good study that I think illustrates this. And if you look at, and it was looking at flower strips next to blueberry fields. If you look at this table in the lower right part of the screen, you can see that in year 1, the control plots that did not have a flower strip actually had higher pollination services than the blueberry fields that had a flower strip. But by year 3, you can see that the blueberry fields with the flower strip are pulling ahead by almost 1,000 kilograms per hectare of blueberries. And then again in year 4, the blueberry fields with the flower strips were 30% higher in yield than the blueberry fields with no flower strips. And they found a really nice association with the frequency of bee visits to these blueberry plants. They were actually tracking that, and they found that So this graph in the right center part of the screen, native bees visiting crop flowers. There was no significant difference in years 1 or years 2, but by year 3, the blueberry fields bordered by the flower strips had significantly more native bees visiting them, and that was also true in year 4. The same was true for visitation by hoverflies. So these two pollinators are likely responsible for the greater blueberry yield in years 3 and 4 for this study. And I think that that's just a good kind of overall picture of what you can expect or what's happening with flower strips in the garden. All right, so we've talked about the habitat requirements of beneficial insects, who the beneficial insects are, the effectiveness of the flower strips. Now let's talk about the most important thing. What are the native plants that have been shown to be most attractive to the beneficial insects? We'll start early in the growing season and take it from there. First off, golden alexanders. So these are absolutely a top-notch plant for beneficial insects. First of all, they're blooming early. They're blooming in May. And that's pretty rare for lots of our, plants that can grow in full sun. But they also have decent shade tolerance, I might mention. They can grow in partial shade. That's probably not relevant to your vegetable garden, though, because it's a sunny place, but I thought I'd throw it out there anyway, because it's such a versatile plant. Okay, so anyway, yeah, golden alexanders are just a top-notch pollen and nectar source for a whole variety of bees, many of which are buzz pollinators. And then in terms of the predators and parasitoids that it's attracting, it's really drawing them in. And one of the most important is highlighted here on the right side of your screen, and these are the hoverflies. Okay, so what's so important about hoverflies? Hoverflies, also known as syrphid flies, have larvae that are voracious predators of aphids. And if you can draw hoverflies into your garden early in the growing season, it's possible that you could prevent an aphid outbreak from happening. It's really hard to contain an aphid outbreak after it happens. They kind of like multiply exponentially, but preventing it before it happens is really the best way to do it. And drawing hoverflies to your garden early in the season with a plant like golden alexanders is really a good way to go about it. Cool, so that's for the month of May. All right, moving on. Okay, in the month of June, common yarrow it has historically been planted all around the world as a beneficial insect plant. It is a very robust plant that is going to, it's short in stature, but it will spread and really thrive. One thing that I really like about common yarrow is that it has a very long blooming period. At the nursery, these started blooming around mid-June, and they were still blooming in the middle of August. So such a long blooming period like that, it's really rare for our native plants. But anyway, the common yarrow, it's attracting a good variety of bees, lots of buzz pollinators. It's going to keep those hoverflies sticking around. And also it's going to attract a really exciting and kind of frightening beneficial insect called assassin bugs. So I have a kind of assassin bug shown here on the right, and this is the wheel bug. It's the largest of the assassin bugs. It is a major beneficial insect and predator. And what does it have at the end of its snout there but the Japanese beetle, possibly the, the most reviled of garden pests? And absolutely, the wheel bug will target Japanese beetles. So they're certainly a friend, even though they're kind of a scary friend, and they, inject their digestive juices into their prey. But hey, they're getting rid of some Japanese beetles, so it's all good. And you should definitely want to encourage them into your garden by planting plants like common yarrow. And like other predatory beneficial insects, when the prey is scarce, wheel bugs and other assassin bugs rely on pollen and nectar to sustain them. All right, moving on. Moving on into the month of July, Virginia mountain mint is one of the absolute top-notch plants for attracting a variety of pollinators. It's really a pollinator bonanza, and this is also a very vigorous plant that likes to spread, much like the common yarrow. And so in addition to attracting the pollinators, it's attracting other beneficial insects. And these especially include predatory wasps. And one predatory wasp that really likes Virginia mountain mint that I think you would definitely be a guest of honor in the garden is the sand wasp. Now, why are sand wasps so great? It's because they love to eat stink bugs, particularly the brown marmorated stink bug. The brown marmorated stink bug, which does so much damage to so many different vegetable and fruit crops, is the favorite prey of the sand wasp. One study in Pennsylvania found that over 96% of the prey that the sand wasps were bringing back to their nest consisted of brown marmorated stink bugs. So certainly a great plant to have in the garden, and hopefully you can attract some sand wasps with it. All right, moving on into later in the month of July, gray-headed coneflower is another plant that's famous for attracting beneficial insects. And I should mention that all of these plants that I'm highlighting, they all have shallow flowers. And this is because a lot of our predatory beneficial insects, they have very short mouth parts. So like the beetles, the wasps, you name it. The syrphid flies, they all can only access the nectar in shallow flowers. So all of these plants that, I'm mentioning have that in common. Okay, well, anyway, the gray-headed coneflower, definitely a great plant to have in your flower strip. It's a very graceful plant with these drooping petals, really adds some beauty to the garden. And it has good tolerance for dry soils, which is another benefit of it. It attracts a lot of pollinators, which I wouldn't at first expect. I don't know. It just doesn't look like it would really have a lot to offer. But I personally have seen like bumblebees just going around in circles on those central disc florets of the gray-headed coneflower. So they really like it. So yeah, it's going to get a big community of beneficial insects. And one of the more interesting ones that I would like to mention are the minute pirate bugs. So minute pirate bugs are attracted to gray-headed coneflower, and these guys are like the cleaners of the beneficial insect world. They're going around and they're going after all of those little sap-sucking bugs like aphids, thrips, scales, and here in this picture, it's going after whitefly nymphs. Another thing that's great about minute pirate bugs is they'll continue to go after the prey even when the prey is at a very low population. So it's almost like they're perfectionists. They're out there to clean these plants off, at least that's how it appears to us, and they do a thorough job of it. My friend Alyssa, who has experience working with biological control measures in the garden, who has actually released pirate bugs onto greenhouse plants, she said that to her it almost looks like these bugs are killing the pests for fun, because they'll go after them even when they don't need to eat anymore. So I don't know, maybe a little sadistic, but it's helping in the garden. So it's a native insect, and it's a very good predatory beneficial insect. All right, moving on. Later in the summer, spotted bee balm is really kind of adds almost a tropical look to your garden. It's a short plant, but very showy with its light pink, beautiful bracts. It almost looks tropical. It's interesting. I went on a family trip down to Florida a few weeks ago, there's a lot of spotted bee balm growing down in Florida. So it kind of is a subtropical plant, but it's also native here in Ohio. And it's a really good one to have in your flower strip. And why is that? The number one pollinator of spotted bee balm are wasps. This is probably the overall wasp favorite plant. And wasps, of course, are major predators as well as parasitoids of our garden pests. So one of the wasps that likes to visit spotted bee balm is here on the right. This is the dark paper wasp. And the dark paper wasp is a predator of the tomato and the tobacco hornworm, which are those caterpillars which can defoliate your tomato plants. So it's definitely, plays a role as a beneficial insect in the garden. Now, I understand that a lot of people may kind of hesitate to be inviting wasps into the garden. And, I can see where you're coming from. But I think that a few wasps, specifically yellow jackets, have given the whole crew a bad name. A lot of wasps are solitary. This means that they don't nest in big social groups. The solitary wasps are never aggressive. Even the social wasps, including yellow jackets, when they're visiting flowers, they're not aggressive. Really, the only time that wasps become aggressive is when it's a social wasp that feels that its nest is being threatened, or that you're posing a direct physical threat to it. And actually, these paper wasps are a lot less aggressive than social wasps like yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets. So it's really a very small segment of the wasp population, and under only certain circumstances that's going to be aggressive. So in the big picture, and especially in the context of gardening with beneficial insects, wasps are definitely a good thing. Okay, moving on to our final plant of the growing season that we're going to highlight, and we're going to wrap it up with a bang here with a real fireworks show. New England aster, one of our showiest native wildflowers, really beautiful with its bright purple rays and yellow disc florets. And so this plant is going to get about 4 feet tall. Now, it can be a bit lanky, and the good news is that you can trim your New England aster to the height that you want it to be. Just clip it every couple of weeks, but then stop doing that by August, and it will just flower at that smaller stature, and it will just have a shrubbier form. So that's a great way to manage a plant that otherwise could be kind of tall, or maybe taller than you want in your flower strip. So one nice thing about New England aster is it's a favorite of migratory butterflies, including monarchs. And I mean, that's just so beautiful when a monarch visits a showy flower like this. But in terms of its value for beneficial insects, it attracts a bunch of pollinators, lots of buzz pollinators. And among the other beneficial insects that it attracts is one of the most interesting, or I should say groups, one of the most interesting groups, and those are the parasitoid wasps. So parasitoid wasps, like we were talking about earlier in the presentation, they're not acting as direct predators on the garden pest. Rather, it's their larvae that are consuming the garden pest as the larvae is developing. And here is actually a photo of one of our native parasitoid wasps. This is called Trichogramma pretiosum. Almost invisible to the naked eye. But this wasp is the maximum size is 1 millimeter. And here you can see that it is perched on the egg of a corn earworm, which, can have a big impact on yields of sweet corn and tomatoes. But it's perched on that egg, and it's depositing its own egg into the egg of the corn earworm. The Trichogramma pretiosum egg is going to hatch. And as the larva is developing, it's going to consume the egg of the corn earworm, and then it's going to pupate and turn into an adult Trichogramma pretiosum wasp, and then it's going to lay its own eggs in more of the corn earworm eggs. And in this way, it can really limit corn earworm outbreaks in the garden. Each female can parasitize as many as 100 eggs. And that's just one of the parasitoid wasps that you can attract with New England aster or the other plants in your flower strip. So that's an overview of some really heavy hitters when it comes to plants that will do well in your flower strip for just minimizing pest impacts to your vegetable garden. And finally, I want to mention that all of these plants they're either available now at Meadow City or they will be available next year. So we're going to be open through the middle of October. Now is still a great time to plant. During the fall, the plants don't really worry about investing energy into their flowers. They're just focusing on their roots. So it gets them off to a great start in the springtime. So we'd love to see you. And with that, I'll wrap it up and I'll just say thanks so much to Friends of Euclid Creek for having me as a speaker. And if anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dave. That was amazing. Heck yeah, that was a really good presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
I didn't see any in the chat, so if anybody just wants to unmute themselves and shout out some questions, go for it. I have one while you guys are finding the unmute button. When you were talking about the brush piles, you said two is better than one.
Yep.
Can you tell us why and how far apart those two piles should be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To be honest, Steve, I don't have a ready answer for you.
Okay.
This was a recommendation from the Xerces Society. And I think that, in terms of the location, I would say just pretty much, it's probably best to have them evenly distributed throughout your space. So if you're going to have, you're going to want to incorporate those other habitat components that we're talking about. So like, I don't know, maybe you can just fit one and that is still going to be, doing a lot of good. But if it turns out you have space for two, I would say just spread them out evenly so that your whole kind of flower strip has, just even distribution of the brush piles.
Cool.
So maybe put them at like opposite ends, or one quarter of the way in, and the next one 3/4 of the way in.
Makes sense. Awesome. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Mary?
I have a question.
Yeah.
We have a lot of deer wandering by our house. Which of these plants are more susceptible to deer, or things that the deer don't like?
That's a great question. I'm going to go back and look at them. Let's see here. So definitely, all right. So the yarrow has fragrant foliage. The deer don't like eating anything that has fragrant foliage. Other ones that have fragrant foliage are the Virginia mountain mint and the spotted bee balm. Okay, yeah. So those three, spotted bee balm, Virginia mountain mint, and common yarrow, those are definitely going to be ones that the deer aren't going to like. We had golden Alexanders growing in the garden that we planted just outside of the nursery, and it was not browsed by deer, but that's really just kind of anecdotal. I would say those three plants that I haven't noticed that these other ones have a big deer browse problem, but it's, I have seen some deer browse on the New England aster. So yeah, definitely those three that I mentioned, the common yarrow, the Virginia mountain mint, and the spotted bee balm, those would be the best in terms of the deer resistance.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I see a question in the chat. If you use a hoe to weed, will it destroy ground habitat?
Okay. Let's see here. That is a really good question. And I think that yeah, that's a good one. All right. So for instance, the bees and the wasps that are nesting in bare soil, if you were to go through there with a hoe, you're definitely going to be disrupting their nesting habitat. I think that would probably be the main negative impact. I don't think you have to. I think it's kind of understood that you're going to be weeding, like using a hoe to weed in your vegetable garden. I don't think that you should feel bad about doing that. I think that's just kind of like part of vegetable gardening, because you can't have those weeds kind of like competing with your vegetables. So I think that using a hoe in your vegetable garden is fine. But in terms of using a hoe to weed in your flower strip, I would say just try not to do that in the bare soil areas that you have set aside for the ground nesting bee and wasp habitat.
Hey, Dave, I might have something to add on this.
Okay, thanks, Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa. I work with Dave at Meadow City. I was reading in a gardening book a different way to approach weeds in flower beds. This author recommended to cut the weeds at ground level rather than hoeing because there's less soil disturbance, both for new weed seeds that might be in the soil. It gives them less of a chance to germinate, and it would preserve that ground nesting habitat. That would only work though if you have a really dense planting where you have, you don't have a lot of light coming through because you just have your native flowers on top. So if you do get that that flower strip to the point where it's very full, a way to preserve that ground nesting habitat may be to just snip weeds versus hoeing them out in those dense flower strips.
I think that's
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Kelly. I can hear you.
Yeah, I was the one that asked that whole question. Is there a time of year when the bees are nesting in the ground, and that would be the time to avoid disturbing the ground? In other words, are they nesting in the spring, in the summer, in the fall more?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that two large groups of ground nesting bees are the mining bees, and there are spring mining bees and fall mining bees. So they're nesting in both the spring and the fall. And then you have other ground nesters that are like, for instance, the like I want to say the small sweat bees, which oftentimes nest in like very dense aggregations like throughout the summertime. So the short answer is I don't really think there's a time when their nests would be kind of I don't know, like immune to being disrupted, just because you have bees nesting in that bare soil throughout the growing season. Now, to add on to what Alyssa was saying about the trimming of the weeds, that like I think that's a great idea. And also, for certain weeds, if you try to uproot them, like not only are you potentially sending more weed seeds to the surface by disrupting the soil, but like Canada thistle, for instance, if there's any root fragment that's left behind, which there almost certainly will be, it'll become a new plant. So like actually repeatedly trimming a weed like that at the ground surface is the best way to make it go away, because it'll just eventually exhaust its underground, its like root reserves of energy, and it'll just stop coming back. So anyway, just another thing to consider.
Does that sound good to you, Kelly?
Well, I have one more question if it's okay.
Yeah,
For
sure.
sure, for sure.
Okay. I'm not specifically talking about garden, I'm talking about the Friends of Euclid Creek Native Plant Garden. We leave the seeds of the plant up in the winter to feed the migrating birds and whatever. In the spring, we have thousands of little tiny plants, seedlings everywhere. So I wanted to use a hoe just to scrape them out. That's why I'm asking so many questions about the hoe. If we gently scrape the soil to get rid of the little tiny seedlings, would that hurt any nesting pollinators?
I see. Well, let's see here. Now, then, I mean, at that point, you're probably talking about, like, if this is like in the springtime, you know, the main ones that would be impacted are the bees that have overwintered and that potentially haven't emerged yet. And, you know, it could be that I know that there are ground nesting bees that overwinter in the nest, or at least, well, I shouldn't say I know that, but I think it's a pretty good, I think it's a high likelihood of it. You know what, Kelly, I'm sorry, I don't have a definite answer for you on that one. I can absolutely see how, you know, you want to kind of don't want the garden to go crazy. But at the, you know, so that's certainly an important consideration. And yeah, that is a tough one though. You know, how to approach that.
Could I say my approach? I have a native plant garden in my front lawn. I didn't take any new saplings out. It's complete, like covered with the plants, no weeds. All my native plants is just, you know, the carpet of these plants. And it's year after year, and I think it's great because like everybody walking dogs like near my house, like on the sidewalk, and say, "Oh, your garden is so beautiful." So I think that it's not necessary to have like, you know, mulch and 3-5 different plants. I think that like the whole carpet of plants is much better. That's my opinion. And then you don't have a problem with weeds and don't have problem with just destroying soil or something.
Thanks, Anna. That's a cool perspective. I'm glad your garden's doing so well.
Yeah, it is. And some of your plants there too.
Oh, wonderful.
Is there anybody else with any other questions out there? We'll give everybody a few minutes, or not a few minutes, but a few seconds. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to extend a huge thank you to you, Dave, and I'm glad Alyssa was able to join as well. Thank you to you too. Meadow City is an awesome place, and hopefully you guys are doing really well in your first year. And if there's anything that Friends of Euclid Creek can do to help you guys out, please don't hesitate to let us know. We'll try to push it on to our membership. And there's nothing else. Kelly, El Presidente, do you have anything that you want to add before we wrap this up? Nope.
Oh, Kelly, you're muted.
Sorry. I asked you to.
Dude, I keep telling it. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, I'll say it fast. Thank you so much, Dave, Alyssa, and Julie. You guys are wonderful to support to Friends of Euclid Creek and everyone in the area that is needing native plants and getting the idea, whether it's for beauty, nature, or gardening. and you guys are doing a great service. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kelly. That's very nice.
Heck yeah, awesome. Well, thanks again for letting us record this valuable presentation. So we will have the link up at some point in the near future on our website, friendsofeuclidcreek.com. And thank you all for attending. And one more thanks to Dave and everybody else at Meadow City Nursery.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks for asking me to be a speaker. I enjoyed it.
Heck yeah, I hope you guys all have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you in the garden sometime.
All right, sounds good.
All right, later, guys.
Yep.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.